Welcome everyone. In this deck, I am focusing on US executive and emerging state level AI rules as part of regulatory and framework landscape. This builds on the previous discussion of EU AI Act, so I want the class to keep that thread in mind. The main question for this topic is simple. How does US executive and emerging state level AI rules change the way an enterprise makes decisions, assigns accountability, operates controls, and proves that the controls worked? As we go through the slides, listen for the movement from idea to execution. We will start with the concept, then move through risks, workflow, tools, implementation, and a short classroom exercise. Now that the topic is on the table, I want to set our learning objectives. By the end of this deck, the goal is not just to define US executive and emerging state level AI rules, the goal is to explain how it works inside an enterprise. For this class, I want you to keep six lenses in mind: policy, process, people, tooling, controls, and evidence. A governance idea is only useful when it changes at least one of those lenses in a concrete way. The example on the slide is our bridge from theory to practice. As I explain it, think about where your own organization would need an owner, an approval step, a metric, or an auditable record. With the objectives clear, we can now ask why this topic matters enough to spend enterprise time and budget on it. This slide is about stakes. US executive and emerging state level AI rules matters because AI governance is not only about writing policies, it is about preventing unmanaged AI behavior from becoming business, compliance, security, or reputational risk. The risk side is especially important here. For this topic, the common failure modes include assuming old executive policy is still active, missing state specific duties, and nobody owns model risk. I would pause on each one and ask the class, what would the first warning sign look like in production? The value chain along the bottom is the through line for the rest of the deck. Policy becomes process, process becomes controls, controls create evidence, monitoring detects change, and enforcement acts when the system is live. Once learners see why the topic matters, the next step is to give them a vocabulary they can use in a review meeting or implementation workshop. Here, I would slow down and make sure the class has shared language. The core concepts for this topic include federal executive policy, state ADMT rules, content transparency, and dynamic effective dates. These are not academic terms, they are the vocabulary teams use to make decisions together. The plain language anchor is the most important message on this slide. US executive and emerging state level AI rules becomes governance only when it changes decisions, control operation, evidence collection, or system behavior. I also want to emphasize the distinction in the lower callout. Documents prove intent, monitoring shows behavior, and guardrails act live. Those three layers work together, but they are not interchangeable. Now that we have the vocabulary, we can turn it into a risk conversation. Where does this topic break down when the enterprise does not operationalize it? This is where the discussion becomes more concrete. I would tell the class every governance topic has failure modes, and our job is to name them before the system is already in production. The risks listed here are tied to controls because a risk without an owner or control is just an observation. For this topic, the control pattern includes legal watch list, jurisdictional applicability matrix, and effective date tracker. A useful classroom prompt is, if this failure happened next quarter, who would notice it, what evidence would prove it, and what decision would the organization make next? The big takeaway is that principles must become owned, measured, evidenced, and enforceable controls. That sets up the workflow on the next slide. This slide gives learners an operating pattern. I would walk left to right through the life cycle. Identify sources, interpret obligations, map controls, collect evidence, review changes, and update policy. The exact labels may change by company, but the governance logic should stay consistent. At each stage, I want the class to ask four questions. Who owns the decision? What evidence proves the control operated? What signal shows the system is still within tolerance? And what change would trigger reassessment? The design rule on the right is the practical point. Low risk internal uses should not be buried in process, but high impact external systems, regulated data, and autonomous agents need stronger gates and runtime controls. Once the workflow is clear, we can talk about tooling, without falling into the trap of assuming one platform solves every layer of governance. Tooling is often where enterprise AI governance conversations get blurry, so I would frame this slide carefully. We are mapping tools by control layer, not shopping for a single magic product. For this topic, the main tool categories include governance platforms using Credo AI, ModelOp, Holistic AI, VerifyWise, monitoring using Fiddler AI, Arise AI, Evidently AI, Nanny ML, and runtime enforcement using Lakra, AWS Bedrock Guardrails, Azure AI Content Safety, Nemo. The point is to show how governance platforms, monitoring, guardrails, testing, tracing, and identity controls play different roles. I would tell the class that tool selection should follow the workflow. First, define the decision, evidence, risk tier, and enforcement need. Then, choose tools that make that operating model easier to execute. With the tool landscape in view, the next question is implementation. What do we actually do first? And how do we avoid overbuilding? This slide is the move from design to execution. I would present these steps as a practical starting pattern for teams that need to make US executive and emerging state level AI rules real without waiting for a perfect enterprise program. The implementation actions here include track the current federal posture and rescinded orders explicitly, monitor state rules such as Colorado SB 26-189 and California SB 942, and update policy and intake questions when effective dates move. I would ask learners to identify which step is policy work, which is process work, which is technical control work, and which creates audit evidence. The minimum evidence box is deliberately concrete. A decision record, owner, risk tier, control checklist, test result, exception status, and change history are the kinds of artifacts that make governance defensible. After implementation, the useful classroom move is to compare mature habits with common mistakes because that is where teams usually recognize their own gaps. Here, I would make the discussion practical and candid. The best practices are the habits that keep US executive and emerging state level AI rules connected to decisions, owners, controls, evidence, and actual system behavior. The common mistakes are equally important. Teams often write principles review too late, confuse governance workflow with runtime security, or forget to reassess after data, model, prompt, vendor, or permission changes. A good way to teach this slide is to ask learners which mistake is most likely in their environment and what one control would reduce that risk in the next 30 days. That sets up the recap. We are going to pull the key ideas together and turn them into a short discussion or lab prompt. To close this deck, I would bring the class back to the central message US executive and emerging state level AI rules. Links AI ambition to accountable enterprise behavior. It is not separate from delivery, it is how delivery becomes safe, compliant, and repeatable. The takeaways summarize the operating logic. Know the controls, separate documentation from monitoring and runtime enforcement, and choose tools that support the workflow and evidence model. For the exercise, I would have learners choose one AI use case and walk through intake, risk tiering, controls, monitoring, runtime enforcement, and audit evidence. The value is in making the governance path visible. When we move on, we will connect this to GDPR, HIPAA, and sector specific compliance needs in regulatory and framework landscape.